Let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to the Apex 30-minute Thursday. Today we're going to be talking about the MX attributes, and Jim is going to be your speaker today. Just to give you a little bit of background, housekeeping, we're going to cover just a little bit about who we are here at Apex. And then I'll do an introduction and let Jim continue on with his scheduled presentation. So just a quick snapshot about Apex. We're a division of ASGN, serving 300 of the Fortune 500 in all major industries. Our solutions are highly scalable and deliverable nationally with over 180 unique IT skill sets in over 70 branch locations across the US, Europe, Mexico, and India. Specifically on our Infor practice, we have experience in more than just healthcare to service many Infor clients, as well as those using Epic, Cerner, and Kronos. As the second largest IT staffing and service provider, we can fill just about any role. Next, please. And again. Without going into all 18 areas of our solution offerings, here at Apex, our consulting practice offers global solutions per industry through digital innovations. Again, like I said, with Infor Epic, agile workforce mobilization through staffing to support any size implementation, and our modern enterprise solutions cover migrations to stand up a PMO and running it for you also if that is a need. Next, please. Most of all, our Infor practice works with clients beyond the cloud, offering the right services at the right time. Before the project or advisory services guide the client through the selection process and assess organizational readiness through process review and design. During the project, we offer prescriptive guidance to reduce risk, duration, and cost. And after the project, managed services helps clients to sustain their investment through on-demand service, staff augmentation, and incident support to be your partner before, during, and after the project. So today's presenter, I'll let Jim introduce himself a little bit and take over the rest of the presentation. It's all yours, Jim.
Okay, thanks, Ann. Yep, I'm Jim Wadilla. I'm an Apex Financial Solution Consultant, and today we'll go through the normal agenda here and, of course, focus on attribute matrix. A couple of things I just want to mention before jumping in is that what we're going to go through here is valid for V10 and V9. Attribute matrix, did not change. And the other thing I wanted to mention as well is that from a security standpoint, there is no risk. There is no risk giving users, access to MX. It is primarily used for reporting, although there are some cases where you can use it for processing as well, but it works in conjunction with other security. And there's one example I'll have later where I'll touch on that. Otherwise, let's take a look at the two different types of attributes that are available, and they are both very different. So the first one is transaction attributes, and kind of as the name implies, it deals with detailed transaction entries, and that it could be, that could be posted to 4 ledgers. Okay, primarily the general ledger, project and activity ledger, strategic ledger if you use that, and multi-ledger. Okay, so those are the transaction attributes, and we'll go through some examples, which will make it clear. Object attributes are the other type, and they have absolutely nothing to do with transactions. They don't intersect whatsoever, and I think that's what kind of leads to the confusion. But object attributes you can kind of think of in terms of almost like a user field. But they're much more flexible, and they can be controlled. Again, we'll see examples, and I think then it'll become a lot clearer. In terms of transaction attributes, they're closely associated with events. Events is kind of a new terminology. If you're familiar with the general ledger and you're familiar with system codes and source codes are basically the same as events. Really quick, if you have a system code, let's say AP for accounts payable, you could have a source code, for example, of VP for a void payment transaction. Okay, so the originating source of that transaction was a void payment that somebody had performed, which of course created an entry as a result. And so for the source codes, there is a limit of up to 3 transaction attributes, which we'll see. And unlike with object attributes, where there really essentially is no limit. Okay. And in terms of the modules that utilize attributes or attribute matrix, as mentioned before, for transaction attributes, primarily it's the general ledger. Activity management, as well, is another very useful place to have transaction attributes. Strategic ledger and multi-ledger, although personally I have not seen it being used in multi-ledger. As a quick side note, multi-ledger is a really nice, straightforward application. If you're familiar with GL, you can use multi-ledger, but I just haven't seen it used much with transaction attributes. The standard object attributes, however, can be used with general ledger, accounts payable, asset management, activity management, buyers, item control, inventory, and so on. I will say that most of my examples are going to be kind of biased toward financials. So I'm going to have a lot of examples, general ledger and payables. Payables is actually one of the applications where transaction attributes are often used the most. Okay. Or I should say, not transaction attributes, but just both types of attributes. Okay, so let's start with the first type, transaction. So what's the usage and why? So basically what's going to happen if you turn on transaction attributes, you will be pulling in more detail into the general ledger, potentially, as well as activity management and SL and multi-ledger. So that is kind of one of the factors you have to consider. So currently, if you do have most of your subledger entries being summarized when they come into the general ledger, this would change that a little bit, because when you turn transaction attributes on, irregardless of your configuration, it will bring in more detail. Okay. However, we're going to see later that can be kind of limited, though, to certain things, certain companies and events. Okay. Another reason that you might, for example, bring in more detail with payables transactions is because you may have some GL users that don't have security into accounts payable, so they can't drill into it either. But using attributes, they can still get 3 key data elements for every single transaction. So so that's one thing. Another thing may be that your GL or casual users may not be familiar with some of the other tools that are available. They may not be familiar with the Excel add-ins, where I can go in and pull general ledger data, and for related tables, I can pull in AP data. Or they may not be familiar with BI reporting, right? Which is where you can do cross-application reporting. So this basically is good for users who are familiar with the GL, but maybe not so much with any of the other tool sets. Okay. And then the other thing here is just that there is some GL reporting available that's out of the box for, in this case, we're talking about transaction attributes. And the other thing is that there are some companies that are very focused on expenses, expense analysis, and again, they may not all the users may have all the other tools to get the data, so they may opt to have these distributions interface in detail, again, for a given source code or event, or maybe just for a given company. I may have 2 companies, but I may only want to turn this on for one of them. Okay. And let's take a look at what we've got next here. So in terms of configuration and maybe existing configuration that you have, this is a screenshot of AP00.4. This is the AP company setup. And you'll notice here that what's circled is the posting option in for the AP company, and it's designated as S for summary. Okay, that's not unusual. And actually, I would recommend that you leave this way. I would recommend, even if you're going to turn transaction attributes on, that you leave this configuration exactly as is. Equally, in the chart of accounts in GL00, those of you that are familiar with the chart, for your detail accounts, okay, you may have the interface posting set to S for summary as well. Again, I would not change this. I would recommend leaving it exactly as you have it, even if you turn transaction attributes on, because the system will automatically know that you want to bring in a little bit more of additional detail, and you may have up to 3 extra pieces of data that you're pulling in to the general ledger. Okay. All right, before we get started, there is one thing I would also recommend that you do, and if you plan to take a look at transaction attributes and see what's available, I would recommend running this report. This is GL205. This is a source code listing. You can run this for all applications. I ran it in my case here just for the accounts payable system, and this is page 2 of the report. And then the source code or event, for example, here that's comes up on the screenshot, is the first one is AP. Just so happens that AP is a system code and it's also a source code. And in this case, the source code or event, AP, stands for vendor payment. Okay. And then down below here, it lists basically all the attributes that are potentially available. Now, you can only select 3. So what that means is that if you turn on transaction attributes for this source code event, AP, right, you can only select 3 things, or up to 3 things. You may say that, well, when a transaction comes over as a result of a payment, in the accounts payable system, of course, I want that transaction to also bring in additional data. In this case, the cash payment vendor, and maybe the cash payment bank transaction number, right? That's the payment number, essentially. Maybe I wanted to bring in those 2 things. And I could do a third, but I don't have to. I could stop there. Just like here below, the other source code that I have in the screenshot here is for vendor invoice distribution. Okay, this has more attributes potentially are available, but again, you can only pick 3. So you're essentially saying that if an entry comes over from the payable system and it's for an invoice distribution, you could say that, oh, I also wanted to bring over into the general ledger and maybe the strategic ledger, right, the invoice number as well. Maybe if I use batch processing, the batch number. And I definitely want the vendor, right? So maybe I say that I just want these 3 transaction attributes to come over with any entries that have this originating source code, which of course is, as we mentioned, a distribution. Okay. So there are other source codes. I think I mentioned one other one, VP for void payment, and then there's others. This is just this is just a snapshot of 2 of them. Okay. And now if we go into the actual source code form, this is GL05. And in this example, I've inquired on source code AD, okay, which again, you can see from the description is invoice distribution. And I will point out very quickly, this is a Lawson defined source code. Okay, this is out of the box. This source code is provided for you. Okay, just like source code AP or source code VP and so on. Okay, and in this example, the transaction attributes have been turned on. Okay, I can see that because somebody had indicated here that they want 3 additional pieces of data to come over with a transaction, right? With this originating source code, AD, and they selected the vendor, okay, the invoice vendor, the invoice number itself, and the purchase order number, if there is one, okay? Now, you'll notice that the attributes here, like the first one here, GL05-vendor, these are actually all user-defined names. So somebody chose to, call it GL05-vendor, which is perfectly acceptable. And then to the right here, you'll notice there's a number here, an originating system value. There's a 5, a 21, and a 20. But more importantly, there's a description here next to that in the display, where this says, oh, this relates to invoice vendor, of course, and this one relates to invoice. I'm going to go back a slide for a second and just show you this, what this display is. It's basically saying, oh, okay, it's basically showing you this. It's showing you invoice and vendor, okay, and PO number. All right, so these element names, that's basically what it's showing you here. Okay, and I think I mentioned before, yeah, you can only pick up to 3, and it's just what's available. It's just from what's available on that report, that source code listing. Another example here of a source code is AP, which you can see from the description here is vendor payment. That was also on that GL205 report. And in this case, they also have transaction attributes turned on for any entries where the originating source is a vendor payment. Okay. The 2 attributes that they had chosen are vendor and payment number. Okay. So payment number, of course, makes sense. You did not have this attribute available to you, payment number, when we were looking at the other source code, AD, right? Because it doesn't apply. Wouldn't make sense. But they chose 2. You could just choose, 1. You don't have to do all 3, obviously. And there is something called an element name, which was on that report, and that actually plays into the setup. But the only thing I'm going to point out here is that for this one here, where it says GL05-pay number, if I go over here and if I drill on or define this originating value, okay, which they have as 8, if I do the drill, it's going to show me that 8 is for this field name, this description, but most importantly, this element name, which is right over here. And it's bank transaction NBR. Okay, that's important when you are creating this initially so that, everything is tied together. Okay. And now we're going to actually go into the MX system and take a look at how that attribute, GL05-pay number, was defined. So the form is MX00. You simply put in an attribute name, a description. You can put in a column heading if you'd like here. So if you're going to pull this information on a report and you want it to just say payment number or something, you could key that in here, or you can leave it blank. And then here's that element name that I mentioned. This is an important part of the setup, in particular when we're talking about transaction attributes. So it has to kind of tie back to what we saw there for the element on the associated with this source code. Okay, and if you were creating this for the first time, you would hit add, and then it would you would get the add complete. You'd have to put in objects. You'd have to then indicate objects. And so if I go here, when you click on that objects button, which is required, you do have to do that. What the object is basically where's the attribute going to be used. Okay, that's what it means. When you click on that push button and it takes you to MX00.3 for the object. Okay, here's my attribute. It's displaying here that I was, let's say, creating for the first time. And then I have to indicate an object type. And again, because these are transaction attributes, there are only 4 transaction object types to choose from. So I would go into the drop-down list here, right? I would click on the select and I would say, oh, here's general ledger transaction. And I also want this to go to strategic ledger. So I go down to the next line and I select strategic ledger transaction. Then I could go down here and maybe put in activity management transaction or maybe multi-ledger transaction. So I could indicate that here, but those are the only four when we're talking about strictly about transaction attributes. Okay. And then over here for transaction attributes, in terms of whether they're required, you have to take the default, which is no. That's that's something we'll get into a little more later. And in terms of the group, you could specify here a company group. So if you have 4 companies and I only want this for 2 of them, I could indicate a company group here and it would only apply to those 2 companies. Okay. And then the end result then, what is going to be the end result if I turn on transaction attributes? This is a screenshot of GL90. This is one of the 2 most used online analysis forms. So GL90 is when you're looking at detailed transaction analysis. And you can see here that somebody had gone in and inquired on the training company 4321, accounting unit 104, and this account number 57300, which is miscellaneous expense. Down below, you can see that there are 4 transactions. In this case, they are all from accounts payable. You can see the system code here is AP for all 4 of these. You have your journal number, of course, your description, your status. These are all HI. They've all been posted already. And of course, the amount. Now, if I did not have transaction attributes turned on, it's very possible that these 4 transactions, if they all had the same keys, the same posting date, the same company, the same accounting unit, the same account, and so on, if they were all the same, this might have been normally summarized to $1,700, but because transaction attributes are turned on, it's going to, bring in the information in detail here as you see it. Now, if I were to go to the second line here, the one for, I think it's $469.33. If I were to go into this selection code field here, this box, and I right-clicked on it, I could do a drill around. I could drill on this information coming from accounts payable. And so this is the drill around pop-up box that you might see. This is what it looks like in Mingle. So you can drill on the journal header. You can drill more on the account. And if this is not grayed out, you can drill on accounts payable information. However, if I don't have security for accounts payable, and this is grayed out, right? I can't access it. I can go down to click on transaction attributes in the left pane here, and then it'll bring up for me any of the transaction attributes, in this case, coming from this entry from accounts payable. And you can see that here is one of the attributes, GL05 vendor number. So there you have your vendor number value. And then, of course, the invoice number as well, which you can see here. Now, there is no PO number on this invoice. So if there was a PO number, it would display here. However, this invoice has no purchase order number. Maybe it was under the threshold. It was under $500. So, whatever reason, there's no purchase order number. Probably the majority of your transactions would have a PO number, but in this case, we don't have that. Again, if accounts payable is grayed out and you cannot actually go into the accounts payable system, whether you're drilling or if you want to go in and inquire on something in AP92, but you don't have that security, what you can do is you can take this transaction attribute information, specifically, let's say the invoice number, and maybe log into your invoice imaging system. If you have that, so if you have this invoice number, you can log in there and do a search there on this invoice number, and maybe pull up, obviously, an image of the invoice or any other information that you may need. Okay. Another end result with transaction attributes is you can run GL256. Sorry about that. This is the General Ledger Transaction Writer Report. It's a little bit similar to GL290, if any of you are familiar with GL, which is the regular General Ledger Report. But this one is a little bit more powerful. It just gives you a little bit more options, and it's kind of semi-customizable, if you will. And so I ran this report, this GL 256, for detailed transaction information. And I put in an override when I ran the report for this company, 4321, and I put in an override for this accounting unit, 104. I did not put an override in for account ranges. I left that blank. I could have put in, an override for specific accounts that I was interested as well, but I didn't do that. And down below here, you can see for each of the lines, they all hit the MIS accounting unit, and the first two basically were posted to these accounts. And I can see if I go over to the left here that there's a system code column. So these are both GL entries, the first two, and that hit this account 51080 and 51090. So those are journal entries essentially. But if I go down further, I see there are 4 AP transactions here. And these are the ones that hit my miscellaneous expense account. And you can see some of these amounts might look familiar. Here's the $469.33. And because of the way I created the format for this transaction writer report, I said I also want the transaction attribute for vendor, for invoice, and for PO number, of course, if there is one. I also then put again here the system code and the source code at the end. I inserted this at the end. So you can see that the system code for these last 4 is AP, accounts payable, and the source code is AD for invoice distribution. Okay. So that's it for transaction attributes. And now we can start talking about the standard attributes, which are a little bit more fun. I see on the time I have to just pick it up a little bit. So in terms of standard attributes, let's take a look at how they are, how the standard attributes are set in the system. So they can be associated with existing objects. What are objects? Well, in this case, an object can be a vendor, an object could be an accounting unit, an object could be an item in the item master, and so on. So those are existing objects. The standard attributes provide more flexibility than user fields. We can flag them as being required. And we can also create what's select drop-down list of valid values. And this is really nice because you can control what people are entering into your attribute field. Okay, so if you create an attribute, user-defined attribute field, you can control what people are going to key in, or if they want, they can click on the drop-down list, right, and see a pick list of what's available. Right, the system will edit that and make sure that they only are allowed to put in valid values. The standard attributes are used with lists, and lists are extremely useful, and they're kind of similar to groups, but they're a little bit more advantageous. There are 2 types of lists. There's dynamic, where you have criteria, and there's a static list, which is basically a manual list. So we'll hopefully have time to take a quick look at an example there. These are used in processing jobs, but primarily for reporting. But there are some examples where the attribute lists are used in processing jobs. And of course, it can be used in multiple modules. Okay, lists for standard attributes. Let's go quickly through this because lists are a key part of it, of this application. And if you don't use anything else in Attribute Matrix, hopefully, you can still take advantage of using the lists. So lists can be based on attributes can be used in processing. I think as we mentioned, security still applies. What that means very quickly is, quick example, I create a list. Maybe it's a manual list, and I say that, I have 2 vendor groups, right? I have 2 vendor groups in my organization. I put both of those into my list, and then I go in and try to run a payment cycle, right? It's a processing, right, step. So I run a payment cycle, and I try to use the list, and the system is going to say, well, hold on a second, you only have security for one of the vendor groups. So that's all it's going to allow you to process. Okay. So even though the list might contain both vendor groups and all the vendors associated with those, it's only going to allow you to do it for the one that you have security for. Okay. Lists can be based on attributes. Of course, can be used in reports. Lists can be based on user-defined attributes, which we'll take a look at a couple of examples. And lists can use ranges from and to. So you don't necessarily have to use a user-defined attribute. You can use a regular object. So quick example, I had a user who wanted all the assets. They wanted to run reports for all the assets in calendar year 2022. Okay. So we created a simple list and we did a range, and we said asset number from asset number 63,709 to asset number 71,504, okay, which represented the first asset added in 2002 and the last asset. So that's a simple list just using a range, okay? Lists can also be based on lost and defined attributes, in other words, objects that are already there. So I can create a list on various accounting units based on different criteria, maybe person responsible. For example, I can create a list on vendors, maybe based on certain vendor classes. Maybe I have 20 vendor classes in my organization, but I'm interested in 12 vendor classes in particular for reporting purposes, or even processing. So I can create a list based on any of that. I can create a list based on assets, like the one I just mentioned, or I can use a range potentially. Activities or projects, items, buyer code, inventory location, and even existing user fields that Lawson provides. Okay, so one user field that is used quite a bit in payables sometimes is the invoice user field 1. There's several. There's invoice user field 2, invoice user field 3 as well, but invoice user field 1 might be one that you always have people key in when they're doing if they manually enter an invoice, as well as when you interface invoices. That might be invoice user field 1 might be one that you also always want to be populated. And then of course you can create a list based on what the value is there. In terms of standard attributes, this is some quick examples. So you may have seen this if you're familiar with AP10, the vendor definition and maintenance screen. You may have seen an attributes button. So this example here, if you clicked on it, would show that there are 2 attributes for the vendors that can be populated. One is product type, the second one here, and they put in DRT. So I could have 100 vendors where the product type is specified as DRT, which means that I can now create a list and say, give me a report with all the vendors where product type equals DRT, okay, as opposed to the other product type, which might be RPX or something like that, okay, or any other product type, okay. So, and if you're in General Ledger, if you're familiar with GL20 accounting units, you may have seen an attributes button there. That would bring you here to this form. And so this is GL 20.7. You can see there are a lot of attributes here. In fact, I had a page down. There were so many. And there are different attributes that can be associated with an accounting unit, such as district, such as state location, such as store manager, and so on. And so then again, I can run a list, create a list and say, I want every store that's in California and Nevada. Okay, I can create a list to do that. And I'll say, go after state location where it equals CA or it equals NV. The one other thing here with accounting unit attributes is you have effective dating. So you can put in effective dates for your attribute values. Okay, if you want one that's going to change in the future, like the store manager or something, excuse me, you can put in an effective date for the new store manager for next month, and so on. If you're an item, if you're in the item master, IC11, if you're familiar with this, there is an attribute button at the very bottom there, and that would take you here. The items only have one attribute set up in the test system here. And it's for S order. There is no value here, so it was not populated in this example, but just to give you an idea of what it looks like. Okay, sorry, I'm a little bit over on time. I'm just going to go through a couple more things very quickly, and then we'll wrap up. Standard attributes here in the chart of accounts. This is a detail account, and again, it has a ATT attribute button. So again, you can see this is what it would look like for an account. And here there are two attributes. One of them is RPT-Alt2. And if you want to see how that would be set up, it was done here in attribute matrix MX00. So here's the attribute name, RPT-Alt2. And then here on the bottom, this is where you enter your from and through values. This is what's going to determine what your pick list or your select dropdown is going to have available for the users. They only have put in 3 things here, but obviously you could have dozens of from and through values. This example only has 3 choices in terms of what they can put in for the attribute RPT Alt2 or alternate reporting 2, I guess. And so, yeah, the object here in this case for RPT Alt2 would be, of course, an account as opposed to, let's say, an accounting unit or a vendor, right? We plan to use this on an account. In fact, we already saw it being used on an account earlier, and here it is again. And these were the 2 attributes. Here is a drop-down select. If you hit that, you would see these are the choices, okay? And that's what we had seen in the setup of the attribute as well. And then just wrapping up. So in terms of usage, if you're familiar with the other most used GL online analysis screen, it's GL95. You can see here that you can use an account list or an accounting unit list if you want to inquire here online. And one of the questions is, well, why would I use an account list as opposed to an account group, which is right below that? Every time you add a new account, you have to go in and do maintenance and add it to your account group. However, every time you add a new account, if you populate a required attribute, right, then the account list in this case will automatically refresh every time. It'll pick up those new accounts each time, okay? And so based on the criteria in this list, it will give you the results. And this is just an example of what some of the results are using this list. And then other usage, very important. Anybody that's familiar with Report Writer knows that if you have a report and you have a row, any detail lines have the ability here to put in more information in the More button. And here you would normally put in an account group maybe, or an account list or a summary account. Obviously, in this example, we're showing you that you can use an account list. Okay. And that's basically it. This is just a list of the reports and some of the processing jobs that can be used. You'll notice the balance sheet is here in the GL income statement. Here, AP 150, a 100 series job, which is an update job, which is the first step in the payment cycle. AP 150 cash requirements can use a vendor list or a cash code list. Down below here, AC 190 activity post, also an update job that uses lists. AM 260, the asset register. This is probably the most used report in asset management. This can use lists as well, in addition to all the tax reports that are available in asset management, like AIM 280 and so on. So this is far from a complete list, but these are all the reports and jobs that use lists and take advantage of attribute lists.